exchange in learning and teaching on a European level. And we will be talking about how university cooperation and peer learning on learning and teaching could take place at European and also at national levels. So my name is Thérèse Zhang, I'm from the EUA office, and we'll just facilitate this webinar, and then we will also have 3 presentations from my colleagues. Before I introduce you my colleagues, I just would like to point out to a few technical features, technicalities related to this webinar. The first thing to say is probably that it is recorded and it will be available later on the EUA YouTube channel. So you can either just go on YouTube afterwards and search for European University Association channel, or all those who registered, and you must have registered because you're there with us, will receive an email with the link to the webinar. This was the first thing I needed to tell you. The second technicality is that you as a participant are able to also interact through the chat box. So whenever you feel like you would like to ask a question or even comment, please do not hesitate to drop us a line or leave us your question on the chat box. There will be several moments during this webinar where we will take questions from the chat box to the presenters. Now that all this technical information has been said, I just need to introduce you to my 3 presenters today. So the first one is Luisa Bunescu, who's the Policy and Project Officer at the Higher Education Policy Unit here at EUA. And Luisa will talk about national initiatives in learning and teaching in Europe. And then we will have a little exchange moment. The second presentation is from my colleague who's sitting next to me. It's Helene Peterbauer. She's also a Policy and Project Officer here at EUA. And she will talk about interinstitutional exchange and collaboration, and specifically on lessons learned from EUA thematic peer groups. And finally, the last presenter we will have today is Michael Gebel. He is the Director of the Higher Education Policy Unit here at EUA, and he will address joint efforts in teaching enhancement and what can be done at European level, drawing specifically from lessons learned from our EFFECT project. So now I will leave the floor first to Luisa to talk about national initiatives in Europe in learning and teaching. Luisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thérèse. Hello, everyone. First of all, can you hear me well? Yes. Okay. Today, as Thérèse said, I will be talking about a study on national initiatives in learning and teaching in Europe that I wrote last year with my colleague Michael Gebel. The starting point for this study was, in fact, one of the flagship studies and initiatives of EUA called Trends 2018. So in Trends 2018, we found very interesting results on institutional developments in learning and teaching, but the study itself failed to produce easily readable data on national policies and initiatives in learning and teaching. So we identified this gap and also this need to know more about national initiatives in learning and teaching in Europe. And so we decided to research on this and write the study. The study is derived also from the EFFECT project, the European Forum for Enhanced Collaboration in Teaching. That's the long name of the project that my colleague Michael, I think, will say more about it. The study basically is based on a series of semi-structured expert interviews on national learning and teaching initiatives that we conducted in the period November 2017 until August 2018. We managed to cover 28 higher education systems from the European higher education area, and in the slide you could see all the 28 systems that we covered. We focused within this study on 3 main areas, namely mapping national initiatives in learning and teaching, then an area on teaching enhancement, and by teaching enhancement I mean pedagogical staff development, be that initial teacher training or continuous professional development, whereas the third area was more on obstacles and enablers for the enhancement of learning and teaching in the systems that we covered. In terms of national strategies for learning and teaching, and you could see the map here. In a majority of cases, most concretely in 54% of the systems, learning and teaching is part of the overall strategy for higher education. And in fact, when this is the case, then learning and teaching basically is not represented by specific goals, rather by generic goals, and rarely contains action plans and financial incentives attached to it. In another 14% of the cases, the systems have a dedicated or standalone national strategy or framework for learning and teaching, and this is the case, for instance, in Austria, in Ireland, the Netherlands, and Norway. In the study itself, you could see that these systems are described more in detail, and you could see what we mean by a national strategy or framework for learning and teaching in these specific systems. Interestingly enough, discussing with experts from countries without a dedicated national strategy for learning and teaching, a slight majority said that they would prefer to have such a framework, such a standalone framework. Most of them said they would appreciate such a thing because they believe that such a framework would be then accompanied by a concrete action plan, by financial incentives, and could represent per se an incentive for the enhancement of learning and teaching in their systems. Another takeaway from the study is that the increased attention to learning and teaching in the European higher education area is also, or is in part due to the enhancement of quality assurance. So we could definitely see a link between quality assurance and learning and teaching, especially since 2015, once with the launch of the European standards and guidelines, when a new indicator, if I may say so, was introduced, namely student-centered learning, for universities to really ensure that their processes are student-centered and their learning and teaching is student-centered. They had to enhance, on the other hand, their internal quality assurance systems. So you could see this interconnection between internal quality assurance, student-centered learning, and the enhancement of learning and teaching. One of the key messages that derive from this study is the fact that EU funding matters, be that through Erasmus Plus or the European Social Fund. It matters is for the enhancement of learning and teaching, especially in systems that do not have a strategy for learning and teaching, that funding is scarce. We mapped several cases where through EU funding, national initiatives in learning and teaching were created, be that in the form of learning and teaching centers, this is the case in Estonia, or pedagogical staff development courses, to name but a few. Now, shortly, in terms of teaching enhancement. Teaching enhancement, again, what we mean by that is pedagogical staff development. Having the interviews with these national experts, we realized that teaching enhancement is usually organized by individual higher education institutions through their centers for learning and teaching or faculties of education. Joint interinstitutional initiatives for teacher training remain limited, and the same goes for higher education institutions in Europe asking for the service of external for-profit organizations for teacher training. Here you have a map on the situation of teaching enhancement in the countries mapped. You would see that a quarter of the systems map regulate teaching enhancement, whereas in 4 systems, while not legally required, teaching enhancement is commonly implemented. In a majority of cases, more specifically 17 cases, systems rely mainly on measures at individual universities. We also tried within this study to map the link, if any, between teaching enhancement and career progression. Well, the picture doesn't look too good in this sense. Only in 9, so basically 32% of the 28 systems mapped, participation in teaching enhancement courses counts for career progression. In the remaining systems, participation in teaching enhancement has no or has an insignificant impact on one's career promotion, which mainly relies on research output. The same goes for financial incentives. Financial incentives or rewards for academic teaching staff participating in teaching enhancement are not common at all. Just one last point to mention, as in the beginning I said that we also discuss with national experts what are the obstacles and enablers in their countries for the enhancement of learning and teaching. The main obstacle is the very fact that research is valued more than teaching, that there's no parity of esteem between teaching and research. And the second most widespread and most important obstacle would be the low governmental funding. I think I'm really at the limit of my time. So just to say that the report can be accessed online under the following link. I think we can also disseminate it after the webinar ends. And at the end of the report, you could see an overview table which is per country. So then you can find concrete information for the 28 systems.
Thank you very much, Luisa, for your presentation. I would like to encourage also our attendees, our participants, so you behind your screen, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We will also have time at the end of all 3 presentations to take the questions. I will perhaps just ask you a little follow-up question, Luisa, right now, because you mentioned it's going to be a little bit provocative, perhaps. You mentioned on one of your first slides that in the case of countries without any national strategy, most of the time the experts you interviewed told you that they would be in favor of having one, if I got it correctly. So. Do you think, from the research you conducted, would you say that national strategies are actually a necessity?
I'm not sure. I think there's no right answer on this, but of course my colleague Michael, with whom I conducted this research, could step in and comment on this as well. I think there's no clear answer on this. I think some of the respondents consider having a national strategy as beneficial, whereas others consider that this is not really needed, especially in mature systems. So in systems where institutions are already doing a lot in terms of teaching for the enhancement of learning and teaching, a national strategy is not really considered necessary. In fact, there were also discussions in terms of academic freedom and institutional autonomy that revolved around this topic. So I think we cannot talk about a straitjacket or of a one-size-fits-all approach. So I think we would have to be a bit careful to the national context when putting forward such a recommendation.
Yes, thank you very much, Luisa. It really reminds me of somebody wiser than ourselves who told me one day that good practices actually could be copied, but national contexts and policies cannot. and you still need to keep an eye on those, of course. All right, thank you very much, Luisa. I think we will now take our next presentation, which is with my colleague Helene Peterbauer, who's sitting next to me. So Helene will present you about taking it a level further. That's the title of the presentation: Interinstitutional Exchange and Cooperation. So Helene, the floor is yours. Thank you, Luisa.
Yes, thank you. Can we have the presentation on, please? Thank you. So I will have the pleasure now of talking about our European Learning and Teaching thematic peer groups. And just to give you a little bit of an introduction of what exactly they are and what their purpose is. Of course, at the very bottom of our purposes with these groups is to consolidate a European dimension in learning and teaching. So what the thematic peer groups are is, it is a set of groups which have been running already since 2017, always a set per year, and they are composed of institutional representatives of higher education institutions of all kinds of national and regional and institutional contexts and profiles. At the bottom of the methodology and purpose is, of course, peer learning and exchange of experiences, simply direct institutional exchange on what kind of challenges are encountered in terms of their topic, and what are already solutions in place, how is this problem being addressed, and what could be recommended to other institutions to tackle the same issue. And of course, the broader goal is to finally contribute to the enhancement of learning and teaching in all its variety across Europe. You can have an overview of what kind of groups we've been having so far and what is going on right now. At the very left, you do have the 2017 groups, and if you make your way to the right, you land in the 2019 groups. So far, we have had 85 participating institutions covering 26 countries. And as you can see, every single group has their own topic, but of course, the group topics build on each other, interconnect, have lots of touching points. Therefore, we have lots of identified challenges and also recommendations, issues addressed that often overlap, and many of these groups come to very similar or the same conclusions, which is very interesting. I highly recommend that you do read the group's reports. They are all available on the EUA publications database. You can see the links here, and will all be sent out. And I really recommend, because I can only touch on the surface of their interesting topics, and you can read all the details in the group's reports. No, I cannot. Okay, to get right into the topic, what kind of key challenges were addressed all over and over again, regardless of the group? Balance in esteem between research and teaching. Luisa has just told us about the current situation across Europe and surely across the world as well. It is a topic that affects learning and teaching at many levels. For example, of course, universities, staff's career paths. If there is less encouragement to enhance teaching or to engage in quality teaching, of course, research will always get more attention, more funding, etc. Community building in learning and teaching is an important topic that is addressed all over and over again, because we do have a research community established across universities, and there are similar efforts to establishing learning and teaching communities, teacher staff communities, but that is difficult. Then, of course, a very important and central topic, which is on everybody's mind, is how to educate those graduates that are on high demand on the current job market. What kind of graduates do societies need? We need independent, critical thinkers who have solid transversal skills. We need active citizens. How exactly do you transmit? How exactly do you give students or provide students with these tools? There are various methods used. Student-centered learning is a central demand at the moment. Research-based education, active learning, but also cross-disciplinary approaches which enhance transversal skills are an approach that is present across institutions, and curriculum design, of course, also needs to fit this purpose. Continuous professional development of all staff, the all is in italics because one issue that has been addressed multiple times by multiple groups is that there is a bit of a focus on either teaching staff or research staff, not even to mention support staff, but continuous professional development needs to cover all staff categories and also acknowledge that the staff categories are not actually separate categories, but that staff at university often cover both support activities, research and teaching, so there is really no point in keeping these categories separate. Finally, good teaching, how to define it, incentivize it, and how to reward it is one challenge addressed by many groups. Of course, also in connection with the question of career paths for teachers. The design of learning spaces is also something that has been addressed multiple times. We are now in the lucky situation of having advanced technology that allows us to learn and teach, not in a physical lecture hall necessarily, or not all the time, but also to turn other spaces into learning spaces. And what does this actually mean for those learning spaces that are left behind and for the teaching methods? And finally, a very important challenge to me, because I've been recently writing about it, is how to effect a cultural shift in the university environment. And this shift would include all staff at campus involved, students, institutional leaders, and the wider higher education community. You can read about this cultural shift, which has been identified in multiple reports by the thematic peer groups. Has been summarized in the LNT paper number 6, titled Towards a Cultural Shift in Learning and Teaching. You can see the link in the presentation, and of course it is also available on our publications database. And it has been written by Tia Lopola, the director of our institutional development unit, and by me, and I highly recommend it. And finally, to cut to the chase, to the recommendations, just to give you a couple of highlights. Linking teaching and research to alleviate some of the challenges that have been addressed multiple times already is a very crucial recommendation. Research-based learning is, for example, a recommendation that has been brought up. It can help to, on the one hand, balance the workload, but also the esteem that is awarded to the research and the teaching activities of academic staff. It provides students, on the other hand, with a very valuable transversal real-life job-based skills. But also, for example, in the form of scholarship on learning and teaching. Scholarship on learning and teaching would provide teaching staff with a chance of profiling themselves as scholars and experts in their field, which might also help to alleviate the imbalance of esteem in between teaching and research. Of course, career paths and criteria for promotion are a topic that has been addressed, and one recommendation is that career paths should allow for different foci in different stages of the career. Of course, it is also boiled down to complementing and variously scaled measures, so there is no one remedy for enhancing career paths and promotion chances for teaching staff, but simply a mentality shift, which is reflected in institutional structures and frameworks that recognizes the teaching profession as not separated from research or other tasks of the academic profession, that is being seen as central. And also a very important recommendation has been coming up all over and over again, establishing a peer evaluation community to match the established peer review-based approach in research. So what this is all about is that in research circles, we already have an established practice of evaluating and reviewing each other's work and Similar measures are currently being established across universities in Europe, and there are institutional frameworks in place to help build a teaching community. But at the same time, it is still a long way to really reach the same level of community that we have in research as for teachers. And inclusive approaches to organizing and designing university life is also something that has been addressed by multiple thematic peer groups. This concerns curriculum design, it concerns assessment processes, but also the design of learning spaces. Inclusive means that not only support staff, administrative staff, and leadership are concerned with designing how the curricula is supposed to look like or what the learning space looks like, but that students are being involved as well as not consumers, but as partners in education, as really vital stakeholders. And all kinds of staff categories on campus are involved. Not just in order to finalize a really great product, but also to make a community of practice of everybody working together on campus to really make high quality education. And one interesting recommendation to achieve this has been to strengthen the focus on the program level. So of course, strengthening the focus on the program level is on the one hand something that should help to make meaningful, fit for purpose programs that make sense from the curricular structure, because on teaching staff there might be the tendency of focusing on single courses, and it might make sense for teaching staff, but perhaps less so for students who receive these courses and take part in these courses. So in order to make coherent programs, really this focus on program design with a program point of view would make sense for both students and teaching staff. But finally, it would also help for teaching staff to build a community if they had the program as a common anchor point, as a common platform to exchange on the experiences, on their teaching portfolios, and maybe evaluate also each other. This would also help to build this kind of community feeling among teaching staff that has been addressed before. Final words, please save this important date. The 2019 thematic peer groups are currently at work, and the topics are evidence-based approaches to teaching, internationalization in learning and teaching, student assessment and curriculum design. And their topics and work will feed into the 2020 European Learning and Teaching Forum. Please don't forget to sign up. It is hosted by Utrecht University in February 2020. And for everybody interested in learning and teaching, this is a highly relevant and interesting event.
All right, thank you very much, Helene. Thank you for your presentation. I just would like to directly answer to one of the questions in the chat. Somebody is asking, Natalia is asking if the presentations will be sent. So that's an easy one, I can take it. The answer is yes. Now I have perhaps a question, quick one for Helene, because we are a bit running ahead of time. You mentioned in several things, the peer learning communities and also what you just said about co-designing, etc., that all turn around the issue of collaborating within institutions. Yes. We also talked a lot about peer learning across institutions, so between different institutions, but I would like to perhaps ask you to comment a little bit on this. Because we know from research we conducted, but also from discussions with colleagues across Europe, that teachers at universities do work in an increasingly collective manner. So could you perhaps comment, especially with regard to what institutions could do for this and what's their role?
Yes, this is actually a very challenging topic, because we would think that simply encouraging teaching staff to collaborate, work together would be a relatively easy fix, but in fact it is not. It has been addressed as a challenge because we do have this model of well-functioning collaboration and community, working together, community of practice and peer evaluation among researchers. And the reason why I'm bringing this example again up is that this is also where really the challenge lies. In order for community for a community of practice and for collaboration among teaching staff to really work, it is important that institutions set up a framework for this kind of collaboration that does not hamper career progression. So it is important that these frameworks, which are already set up in some institutions, but which still needs to be elaborated in others, do not make career progression on the one hand and collaboration with colleagues and peers on the other hand compete with each other. And it is important that measures are being set up in this regard. And it is therefore also important that not one single measure is being put in place, but that many measures are working together. For example, as I mentioned, having different stages in your career might help to let teaching staff focus on their teaching activities instead of research in one point of their career than at others. We also have been talking about peer evaluating. This is especially important for early stage academics. So for example, PhD students who are also employed at universities, they often lack this kind of peer support and being involved. So there needs to be teaching enhancement, professional development measures right from the beginning and throughout the career. And different measures needs to come in as well, of course. It all needs to be scaffolded and well balanced.
All right, thank you very much, Helene. I think we will go now into our last presentation, and then we already had three families of questions, let's say, that we will address after the last presentation altogether. So our third and last presentation is from Michael Gebel, and he will talk also about collaboration, but mostly about developing a European dimension for learning and teaching. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Thérèse, and I'm not sure if I have much content to add to what has already been said. It's probably more a reflection on the points that have been made. So I think when we start to talk about a European dimension for learning and teaching, I think the first question is, what could that actually add? How could this support what is done by individual teachers, by institutions, and by national level initiatives? And probably starting from teaching and teaching enhancement, I think one point that we could take up, and we try to do that through the EFFECT project and also through the Learning and Teaching Forum and the TPGs, is to somehow advocate a more comprehensive and more complex notion of teaching enhancement. So when we started in 2015, we were often confronted with views like, well, it's just about teaching teachers a few tricks, so how to use new methods and how to teach with digital means and so on. And I think it's, once you delved into the matter, you find out how that this is very simplistic actually, and that the issue, as Helene also has mentioned it, it's really about staff development, probably even more as the teachers, if we talk about teachers, they're in fact part-time teachers, and we sometimes prefer to talk about staff with teaching responsibilities, because they are also researchers, they are administrators, they work on outreach, third mission goals, and. So to get to a more realistic picture of the academic profession and situate then teaching as one of the tasks that they have to fulfill, and ask what they would need. And what they would need is probably also about thinking about different formats that could be used. So I think the participation in a conference could be one, projects could be a way, and also the peer learning schemes that not only we use, but probably others. Also moving away from the idea that there are special methods that can have just to be learned and applied then in classroom. And also what the goals for teaching enhancement are. If you saw the list of the thematic peer learning groups, you could see this was not all about pedagogics, but it could be also be about wider goals. In the EFFECT project, for example, we had a series of staff development workshops sensitizing the participants to issues of social inclusion and citizenship, just to give an example. I think this would also help to or create a motivation for participating in these courses. Another point, and that has also linked to this, and that has also been mentioned by Helene already, it's really about how teaching is recognized as a professional activity, and that it becomes part of the career path. And the analogy with research is and the link with research is, I think, very important, because we know that from the trend studies, when we asked the respondents, more than 300 from all over Europe, what do you see as the key obstacle for learning and teaching development at your institution? Right after finance, what all identified as the second biggest challenge was that there was no parity with research. So whatever you do in teaching in your career, it doesn't count, or it does not count as much as research. And I think these are important issues that have to be could be addressed at European level and get a more shared view about these issues. We know that in some institutions, as Thérèse has mentioned, they are already addressed. Some systems have taken them up, but this is not yet everywhere. I think the second point that I had here is about, and that came up again and again in the forum, but also in the EFFECT project and its events, is creating space and opportunities for meaningful conversations and for collaboration. This sounds banal, but as Helene has mentioned, collaboration between teachers is not very common yet. One has to build an understanding that this is not just about individuals, but about teams that have to work together on teaching, and that it requires also support from the entire institution, including to the leadership. And I think institutional strategies have been one of the foci of the EFFECT project. And when you bring in the issue of strategies, you often get an interesting reaction. It falls somewhere between fatigue and alarm lights, I would say. And one has to explain that this is not about a strategy that sits then there as a piece of paper or on the website, but really strategies developed in participation with the members of the institution, staff and students, and as a basis for collaboration, and strategies which are also underpinned by resources and structures. And there, I think we see some interesting developments in some institutions, also concerning the leadership support that these strategies will require. So increasingly, we can see that the office of the vice rector academic is changing. So that was traditionally the person who, from an administrative point of view, has been in charge for learning and teaching staff and students. But nowadays, this is really the person who is in charge to develop a vision for the institution and ensure that the many top-down, the many bottom-up initiatives that exist in the institution, that they are somehow resourced, anchored, and brought together in the profile that the institution wants to develop in learning and teaching. So when I say this about how you can do that within institution, also to nurture, Helene talked about culture, to nurture a culture there for learning and teaching, and also a culture for participation. I think you could also do that, of course, among institutions and in university networks. And this is what we see, that this is going on. We don't know much about it, but we were actually surprised on how much institutions indicated in the trends survey that they collaborate with parties outside of the institution. Luisa emphasized national initiatives that exist in some countries. Some were initiated by national ministries, but some were also brought into existence by universities, for example, through the national rectors conferences. And I think that's an important point. So how can these structures, how do these structures work? How could they be strengthened? I think that would be an important question then when you ask for European level initiatives. How could we contribute to exchanges, for example, among national initiatives? I've been yesterday at a Nexus event. Nexus is the network in Germany on exchange in learning and teaching established by the German Rectors Conference, and there the issue came also up: how can we have more exchange also across the national borders? So this would be something that, this is something that we do already through the Learning and Teaching Forum. We bring people together from different national initiatives, but I think what is also important, we also bring people in who don't have national initiatives. And if I look at the list of the participants, I think there are probably quite a few which may not have, maybe cannot rely on established initiatives for learning and teaching in their own countries. So what can be done then? I mean, concretely, well, we have the Forum for Learning and Teaching already ongoing. We have the thematic peer learning groups. We had some initiatives done through the EFFECT. The question is then how to develop other ideas. We made some proposals in the EFFECT feasibility study that has been published last month. I'm not going into details there. Just to mention here in the end, as my time is also over, it's important for the institutions, but I think it's also important for policymaking, because we as EUA, but probably also colleagues at national rectors conferences, get more and more under pressure to say what we actually want, and saying just, well, leave it to the institutions, they will somehow sort it out, might not be good enough anymore. If you look into the Paris Communiqué 2018, there is a headline there, a whole section on innovation in learning and teaching. And I think many of the things that are said there are quite useful, but in the next round, it will be important to fill them with concrete things. That's
Thank you very much. Thanks, Pierre. No, I think we still have a little bit more than 15 minutes left, so we will have time for an exchange. And I also see that there are some questions that actually started to flow in. So I will perhaps pick them in order. And first, there was a question for Luisa, I think. Where is Luisa on my screen? Yes. There was a question for Luisa because this relates more to the national initiatives. Luisa, it's a question from Philippe Ampli. Hello, Philippe, from Belgium. And he's asking, national initiatives for teaching enhancement, are they more important if career progression of teachers is managed at national level rather than at institutional level? Is that something you could say from your research or your interviews? This more systematic link between national initiatives and career management at national level?
First of all, hi, Philippe. I'm not sure to what extent we can deduct this connection. If I look at the 9 systems that said that basically they reward teaching enhancement through career progression, you have a top-down approach where basically the ministry decided, perhaps I'm not sure to what extent this is the case with higher education institutions, that this should be the case. So, for instance, in Austria, you have this link, part of the performance agreements. In Denmark, teacher training counts to the extent that teacher training is compulsory for junior academic teaching staff. So if they want to move from assistant professor to associate professor, they would have to prove that they have undergone teacher training, and so on. So of course this is relevant as long as you have a national framework. But I think career progression is managed by the institutional leadership within the framework, of course, if this is a case of a national systemic approach to career progression.
Thank you very much, Luisa. Thank you. Perhaps there is another question we can ask that is related to this. This is a question from Marta Zuvic, and she was asking earlier if there are any models for assessing teaching excellence at institutional level. Actually, this is something I can answer, if I may. Could you please put back Helene's presentation, the slide with all the links? Yes, Marta, because yes, when you talk about teaching excellence frameworks or models, the first one that comes to mind is, of course, the best known one is, of course, the one from the UK, the Teaching Excellence Framework, elaborated at national level and against which institutions are assessed. But this is a quite debated framework as well in the UK context. There are a few others for such frameworks, and also several that are discipline-based, discipline-related. And this is something actually one of the thematic peer groups of 2018, the one on career path in teaching, specifically looked into. So this slide, you know, I hope have on your screen, is about this. So it's the second link, career path in teaching. There was a report, and you can perhaps go and have a look. What the group did is that they had a PhD candidate conducting a research throughout all existing teaching frameworks. And at the end, the group made a proposal for what they called a teaching expertise framework. They deliberately left out the word excellence because they wanted to underline the developmental dimension of this framework. And it could be a model for self-assessment. It could be a model also for assessing teachers. But most importantly, it could be a model for having a common language, for holding this, what Michael called these meaningful conversations about learning and teaching. So the idea of the TPG, of the thematic peer group, looking into teaching framework, teaching-related frameworks, was also the idea that whatever the framework of the model is, it should contribute to nurture this culture of teaching and learning communities so that ultimately it makes sense for the staff themselves in a developmental perspective, but also in the perspective of bringing learning and teaching into conversations. So that was for that question. There was another question, There was another question, I think, well, it's rather a comment from the University of Turku in Finland, from Matti, hello, who says, just one notion about teacher collaboration. Research shows that peer collaboration can start from learning from each other, so exchanging good practices or best practices, but in the end, the most important benefit is actually emotional support and well-being at work in general. Helene is looking at me, so I think she would like to comment on this. Go ahead, please.
Yes, because you just mentioned the report about career paths in teaching. And actually that one was very enlightening in this point as well, because the group conducted interviews with PhD students, early career researchers, and they actually do attest to a very broad feeling of insecurity, competition, stress. On the one hand, because it is very difficult to balance all the different requirements of academic life at one point, not really being able how you are supposed to do all of this and still be a first-class researcher at the same time, but also because very often in the beginning, real support also in terms of teaching training, and I'm already touching upon another question that we received through the chat, is missing. So Of course, peer collaboration can enhance teaching. It can lead to evaluating and improving each other's work. But of course, the emotional support is very important. I would just like to point out this is a very important point, especially in terms of early career teachers or researchers, because they often lack this support and community. But of course, it is also important to keep this up throughout the academic life circle. And I'm sorry if I'm already touching upon the next question, because it connects to this issue. Irina Dektirova from Warsaw comments that good teaching is not only about knowledge of the subject, so disciplinary knowledge purely, or great success in research, but it's also about soft and transferable skills. So these transversal skills we have been talking about in terms of how to really educate valuable, active citizens and critical thinkers. He also says it's very important for newcomers in academia. So teachers training should be part of master's and PhD training. So what is about initial teacher training? And we do indeed find that initial teacher training is offered at a certain point in the career, but not always part of PhD training and hardly ever part of master's degree students training. Very often there is initial teacher training, but then follow-up action is often missing. So another recommendation of a lot of the groups is that teacher training, teaching enhancement efforts, continuous professional development, all of this should be a continuous effort. It needs to be provided right from the beginning, preferably right at the beginning or maybe a little bit before the academic career starts, and continue throughout. And of course, there should also be incentives to engage in this. For example, in actually rewarding and acknowledging taking part in this teacher training and really trying to improve and innovate your teaching methods.
Thank you, Helena. If I can just make a comment on this about initial teacher training and included in the PhD. This is something actually we looked at when conducting the trends research. So from the EUA trends survey that we conducted in 2017 and the publication dates from October 2018. You can find it very easily on the EUA website, publications, and by just searching for trends. And one question in trends was to also examine a little bit to what extent this is part of the PhD training and to what extent this is a requirement when hiring academics. And what we found out, and we also took some other sources from the European Commission, for example, is that it's only in a minority of systems across the EU and across the European higher education area that teacher training is mandatory in PhD training. So it's not really that common, actually. And then, yeah, of course, as you already stressed, I think the most important is what they do out of this. And in that regard, the thematic peer group on career path also found out through a series of interviews of PhD candidates that the issue with this is also time, pressure due to time. Because it's not that they don't want to get trained to be better teachers, but they have so much pressure in terms of having outstanding research outcomes to advance in their careers that it is sometimes not that easy actually to really concentrate on making the best, the most out of your teacher training. This actually relates to the previous question about emotional and well-being as well. All right, I have 5 minutes left, so I will try to be intelligently selective. I have a question here from Araceli from Spain. Hello, Araceli, nice to see you here. You mentioned scholarship of teaching and learning. To what extent this could be the more realistic way to enhance learning and teaching in research-intensive universities? So this is a question about basically researching on teaching. I don't know if one of the presenters would like to comment on this. Perhaps Michael would like to comment on this?
Sorry? I was on what? Sorry.
On the scholarship of learning and teaching.
Yeah, I think it links a bit to what you just said about teaching debutants, teaching beginners. So the question is, can you get it into the academic career? Because this will matter. So the same warning probably, I mean, of course it would be desirable if people doing a doctorate, when they get also an introduction into teaching methodology, and on the other hand, if that only comes on top of everything else that they should do, and knowing that they will be assessed, recognized through research, will that be useful? On the other hand, it would be worth opening the discussion and to say, as you have to learn research methods, so have you also to learn teaching methods, and should not everybody who teaches also have an understanding and a sense of who is a researcher also have a sense on how he teaches, how he communicates on his research.
All right, thank you very much. I see that our participants actually are heating up, and there are a lot of comments circulating on the chat box. So thank you very much to all for this. Fortunately, I have 4 hands here because we also have Ines, our colleague, who's helping us with this. I have a question here from Manel from Barcelona. Hello, Manel. Nice to see you here as well. He's asking if it is more effective when facing, when facing teacher training, having all the community of teachers all together to take advantage of their differences, or split it into phases, considering the stage they are in. So better to have all teachers together trained, and then so that they play on their complementarities, or better to take them at the stage of development they are, at the stage of career they are. I'm not sure it's an easy question, actually. I'm turning to my presenters. If any of you has an opinion.
I would say a mix of both would be absolutely essential, because you are, with these 2 kind of approaches, you are addressing 2 different kind of purposes. Probably putting people in the same stage of their career together would rather be for the emotional support and really exchange on experiences at their own level. So the emotional support we've been talking about before, but also for natural community building, whereas bringing everybody together with different profiles being all mixed, you would really harness the power of perhaps PhD supervisors being able to evaluate and give feedback to the PhD students, to their mentees. So I really think that a mix of these 2 is the most beneficial approach. Of course, that is if you have the funding and the right framework to implement this.
All right, thank you very much. Luisa, you would like to comment?
Yes, one short comment on this, if I may, and basically to couple together what Manel said with the previous comment put forward by Philippe, that we need holistic and encompassing institutional strategies in order to address learning and teaching in a meaningful way. I believe this is very relevant, and I think this is not coming up from research. It's just a personal opinion of mine that we should really nurture and build on complementarities. As Michael mentioned, within EFFECT, we conducted a series of pedagogical staff development workshops, and I think, and also this based on the feedback of the participants, the discussions were more enriching and meaningful when basically we brought together not only teachers, but we also involved administrative staff, when we also involved students, and basically when we created the network and the platform where not only good practices were shared, but as well as support, peer-to-peer support. So I would say that complementarities are very important when thinking about sustainable institutional strategies for the enhancement of learning and teaching.
Thank you very much, Luisa. I think I can only agree with this. Complementarity is definitely the key word in this matter. Michael, you wanted to say something?
Well, just to confirm what has been said, and I think that was also the main message that we got from the affect feasibility study. We basically said there is no blueprint for what you have to do. You have to look where are the problems, where are the challenges, what you try to reach, and then all kinds of approaches could make sense. I mean, you could bring the entire institution together, including staff and students, or you could gather the members of the physics department and discuss with them how they see learning and teaching. Yeah. And the same then whether you operate at national level or get into international exchange. I think at a given moment in time, certain measures might be useful, and it would be important to have the sufficient resources for a strategy that backs that up and people who can facilitate that.
Yes. Well, I think that was a good conclusive word for this webinar, which is good because actually it's 3 p.m. now. So I think we will have to leave you soon. I just would like to say once again, thank you all for joining this webinar, and thank you all also for animating the chat box, because at one point there were really several things going on, and I can see that there was interest, and that for us, of course, is always very stimulating as well to kind of be able to address questions and continue our reflections based on that. I just would like to remind you that the webinars are recorded. You can find them back on the EUA YouTube channel, but you will also receive a link to them, and you will also receive the presentations. And finally, perhaps underline that if you're interested in EUA webinars in general, they usually take place on the last Thursday of the month. Just keep an eye on the EUA website, because normally they are announced well in advance. And then, of course, feel free to join us on social media as well, through the LinkedIn group, for example, Learning and Teaching in European Higher Education, or through the hashtag EUA in Twitter. All right, I would like to thank first my presenters. So Helene is here with me, but also Michael and Luisa upstairs, or groups, yeah. And thank all of you for your questions and your interest, and we hope to see you soon again in one of EUA webinars, of course, or in our event. Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.